Hi everyone! So one of the more interesting builds I've tried on a Season 5 PTR was for the Rogues, an Arrow Storm build. Now this is something I had been memeing on basically the entire Season 4 because Arrow Storms was just kind of like not really much of a thing, and people tried to combine it, for example, with Heartseeker and a Victimized build where Arrow Storms would just do nothing basically. And, well, I tried to make like a pure Arrow Storms setup work. So that's what you're seeing here in action. This is entirely doing damage with the Arrow Storms. And I'm cruising for this pit 100 here. I've actually quite tried higher as well. I did like a 4-minute run in 110 or so of this. And again, this is not really optimized. I had like relatively crappy gear, 4 out of 12 masterworks and so on. And the really good part about this setup is that it kind of just works from the start. The two Arrow Storms aspects are both available in a Codex dungeon, so you can basically get them at level 1 and just start playing the build. Now, of course, you need to hit like a certain minimum amount of like lucky hit and attack speed to really make it feel smooth, so that you actually produce those Arrow Storms if you entirely rely on those. But it is possible, and this is what you see here right now. So effectively, this is something very close to Andariel's Rogue. In fact, I took the Andariel's Rogue setup from Season 4 and then I started tweaking it towards an Arrow Storms build. And the two setups are pretty close to one another in terms of like how they are built at least. This is Spam Puncture and use Flurry as a buff tool. And we also use it as a mobility tool now. This has a built-in dash here in Season 5, for example. So that's really cool. And you just spam your punctures, proc lucky hits, and have those Arrow Storms all over the place. So this is actually a really cool way of building this setup and also playing it, because it already gives you everything you need to then later transition into the Andariel's Rogue. So I did a small paragon change, a few things on the tree, nothing really crazy. But if you want to play an Andariel's Rogue, which is going to be one of the strongest builds in the entire season, well, you can play Arrow Storms until then, and then swap to Andariel's if you want. I believe that pure Andariel's Rogue will definitely outshine the Arrow Storms Rogue. Technically, you could even do a combo between them because you have so much overlap in how you build a character. But I tried that and it definitely looked like it would probably just be better to go all in on the Andariel's at some point, because it's just so powerful. Like people can do like billions of DPS with Andariel's on a good nuke, and I don't think we're gonna get there with the Arrow Storms. But it's quite realistic to hit something like 100 to 200 million DPS or so, which will definitely carry you into the higher pits already. And then whenever you get that Uber, then you can go and swap to the Andariel's setup. So this is kind of like how I expect this to go. So what you just saw was actually with wearing an Andariel's Visage in addition to the Arrow Storm stuff. So you have to make a bit of concessions here to include both at the same time. And the Andariel's will not work at full power, and the Arrow Storms will work kind of at full power and in such a setup. So if you really want to combine the two, there are some perks, but I guess realistically it's full Andariel's once they have the setup. But you have an easy swap from this. And this is a pure Arrow Storms Rogue, and you see here we can clear those hundreds just fine. So as long as these Arrow Storms proc, and you can have, you know, like high amount of crit chance, high amount of crit damage, and these kind of stats, well, we are just blasting here. And there's also another cool inclusion in this setup, which is the new Shroud of Khanduras. This is a new unique that is coming for rogues that allows you to pull enemies together with your evade. So whenever you evade, you do like a shadow explosion, everything gets pulled in there. And this is really useful because these Arrow Storms, they are really tiny. They just cover like a very small area, and you want to try to stack them all in the same spot, and then let it rain and they will melt. So it's kind of interesting, and I really enjoyed playing this on a PTR. So this is something that I might actually consider to you know, level and character with from start to finish in Season 5 and see how the level progression goes. But you see here, the visuals look amazing. I personally love seeing those Arrow Storms, and it is actually pretty viable now. So just to show you the planner a little bit, this is what it looks like. As I mentioned, I've basically taken the Andariel's Rogue. In fact, I actually have Andariel's here, but if you don't have that, you will just take like a normal helm that has lucky hit and, you know, some defensive power, and you just throw it there. And then we can basically build the entire setup similar to the Andariel's Rogue. So we have Puncture there to give us the vulnerable and a lot of lucky hit. We can do the puncture cast twice here on the tempers so that we have even more lucky hits. We have a lot of attack speed because the flurry with common points gives you 45%. We get 15 from the potion. We get a bunch from, for example, the rapid aspect here. And we also have the reworked Alchemical Advantage. So this is a really powerful passive for anything that needs lucky hits on the rogues now. This now gives you 5% attack speed and 5% lucky hit per point. It's crazy. And this makes it very easy to trigger those arrow storms or even the Enquiries later. Now there's like one problem here, which is that you can kind of have too much lucky hit because there's a cap on arrow storms. You can only have 7 of them up at a time. So you need to roughly trigger one of them like 2 to 3 times per second basically. And you can kind of overdo it with the attack speed and the lucky hit. But there is a solution here as well, which is that once you get to the point where you kind of feel you have consistent 7 or even too many arrow storms up all the time, then you can actually increase the DPS of the setup by slowing down and having a slower weapon. So what I mean is that, for example, the setup right now runs daggers, but you could do this with swords, which are slower but have higher damage per hit. So the arrow storms become stronger when you use a sword because of the, they have the same DPS, but swords are slower. And you can even do the same with crossbows. So it is thinkable to play this with Heartseeker, for example. Similar to like a Heartseeker rogue, we have like, the 15% crit there as well. You get the attack speed there, and then we get the ricochet. And you can actually produce relatively comparable lucky hit values to puncture when you play Heartseeker. And this is really useful because then we have a crossbow, which is even slower than a sword. And going from daggers to crossbow is like a damage increase of something like 30% or something like that, if you manage to have your crossbow in hand when your arrow storm procs. So this is something that at least I'll be like field crafting more in detail and then exploring and see where exactly is the point where this will feel smooth and you actually still reach your 7 arrow storms cap every time. So there is a bit of like a breakpoint basically that you need to hit, but this is also an option here. Instead of puncture, you do this with Heartseeker and then play pretty much the same setup. But the thing is that if you entirely rely on the arrow storms, you also want to make sure that you trigger them fast so that you reliably actually pull enemies together and then explode the pack and move on. You don't like shoot like 5 times or very slowly and then wait for the arrow storms to appear and then slowly start raining and then slowly get a second one or something like that. The consistency is kind of important here to make this feel good in a speedrun. So this is kind of like why I started with the typical puncture dagger setup. But I definitely noticed I was overcapping with only 7 arrow storms up at a time. We definitely had too much lucky hit in the setup at some point. So there are some tweaks like that I will be making, and I'm probably going to have like multiple versions here down in the planner when I go over it again after the final patch notes. Also, this is a close quarters combat build, so in case you're wondering, you will have to play around this. I don't think that there's really any hope to use any of the other key passes. There is maybe exposure. I tried this briefly. You do have a lot of like overlap here with attack speed and lucky hit to trigger exposure, but it's actually kind of hard to fit in exposure. One thing that I would maybe recommend is trying to include Death Trap and for example the explosive worth aspect to make your smoke grenade a trap as well, so you can reset those 2 skills together whenever you smoke grenade a pack, which you're going to do all the time, but it only really makes sense when you don't have the Shroud of Khanduras. So maybe for like the early game setup, before you have like really good gear and can actually scale close quarters in any significant way, because you want to stack a lot of this crowd control damage here, maybe you can run exposure, have the Death Trap instead of the Dark Shroud on the bar, and like this you can pull enemies together, similar to what Shroud of Khanduras will do for you later. But once you have this item, you don't really need any of this anymore, and then you go for Dark Shroud to have the 3 seconds immunity. This makes it really nice and easy to fight these pit bosses as well, because you have you can just immune most of their abilities basically, and then you have pretty mobile, you can like jump around with the dash and the caltrops and so on. So it's like a really good package here. So all in all, the Arrow Storms Rogue is coming. Stay tuned for more. I'll be theory crafting a lot now in the next month as we go towards Season 5. And then, of course, once the final patch notes are out, I expect some pretty major shifts there. But this is also a build that I think is pretty nerf resistant, let's say. There's certainly some nerfs coming for some other stuff, but this is probably not one of them. So yeah, this is what we got here for now. Just hope that you enjoyed my overview here. So Arrow Storms Rogue, not the best build, but definitely a really good starter, I think, for Season 5 for the Rogues. So, hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys next time.